Three fundamental principles. Now I wish you further to understand clearly the principles of modern civilization which we desire to uproot and also the principles which we want to establish in their place. Modern civilization, on which resolves the whole present-day organization of the world, intellectual, moral, cultural, political and economic, is, in reality, based on three fundamental principles which are secularism, nationalism and democracy. Secularism. Of these, the first principle, secularism, implies that the divine guidance, the worship of God, and obedience to Him should be confined to the personal life of each individual, and except for the small sphere of a person's private life, all the other affairs of this world should be settled purely from the worldly viewpoint according to our own wishes and expediency. In such matters it is out of question to think of what God may have commanded, what His guidance consists of and what the divine books may lay down. This attitude owes its origin to the reaction that set in among the Western people as a result of their hatred of the man-made theology of Christian missionaries, a theology which had become a curse for them and which forged their shackles. Gradually, however, this attitude developed into an independent theory of life and then became the foundation stone of modern civilization. You must have quite often heard the utterance, "Religion is a private affair between God and man." This brief sentence is in fact the creed of modern civilization. It implies that if a man's conscience bears witness to the fact that there is a God who should be worshipped, he is welcome to do so in his individual and personal life. But God should have nothing to do with this world and its collective affairs. The system of life built upon the foundation of this creed seeks to free from the influence of God and religion all the relations between man and between man and this world. Culture, education, economics, law, parliament, politics, the administration of public affairs and international relations are all to be divested of this influence. Whatever is done in all these numerous aspects of life should be regulated by one's own whims and knowledge. It would be irrelevant, nay, wrong in principle and even a sign of the utmost ignorance, to say that God has prescribed certain principles and laid down some commandments, for us for the regulation of such matters. Due to education being divested of religion and the prevalence of irreligious nationalism, education among most people even in individual life is merely secular education, and it is developing further on these lines. This is because there are very few men left who conscientiously believe that there is God and that we should worship Him. In particular with men who are actually the de facto leaders of modern civilization, religion is not even a private affair, even their personal relations with God are snapped and torn asunder. Nationalism. The second principle, nationalism, owes its origin to a reaction against the universal oppression of the popes and Caesars. It merely aims at making the various nationalities completely free to exercise their mastery over their own political and other affairs and not merely acting like puppets in the hands of any spiritual or political power of a universal character. From this innocent and small beginning the idea developed and reached a stage where it placed nationalism on the throne of God, who had already been ejected from his position under the impact of secularism. For every nation the highest moral standards and values have now become synonymous with its own national interests and aspirations. Virtue consists in what is advantageous to the nation, be it falsehood, faithlessness or disbelief, oppression or any other act which may have been looked upon as the worst sin in the eyes of the old type of religion, and evil is said to be what is injurious to the national interests, be they truth, justice, rights and obligations or anything else which may hitherto have been considered a moral virtue. The measure of virtue and standard of life and conscientiousness of individuals in a nation is now merely this, that they should not fall short of any sacrifice in the interests of their nation and should give up their lives, wealth, time, and even their morality, humanity, virtue and nobility of spirit. They are not expected to desist from these sacrifices, and should devote themselves wholeheartedly in an organized and unified manner to fulfill their national aspirations. The aim and object of all collective effort now lies in every nation producing such individuals in greater abundance and in organizing and uniting them so that they may raise the standard of their own nation as against that of the other nations. Democracy. The third principles, democracy or sovereignty of the people, was originally put forward to loosen the oppressive grip of monarchs and feudal landlords over the masses. to the extent to which it sought to expound the idea that no individual, family, or class, has any right to force its will on millions of other peoples and use them for their own selfish ends, it was perfectly correct and laudable. But with this negative aspect it implied a positive aspect also, in that the people of each country and territory are their own masters and rulers. This positive aspect later on developed into democracy, which meant that every nation is entirely independent in its will and actions. There is nothing to restrict its collective desires, or in practice, the desires and aspirations of its majority. Whether it be in the sphere of morals, culture, social relations, or politics, only such principles are to be deemed right and correct as are accepted as such by the unanimous will of the nation, and those principles which are voted down by the nation as wrong must be looked upon as such. The making of laws depends on the sweet will of a nation. It may make any laws, break any laws, or modify and change any laws. Government should be carried on in accordance with the wishes of the nation, should abide by its vote, and should spend all its energies in fulfilling the aspirations of the nation. Critical appreciation. These three principles, which I have briefly explained, are the cornerstone of the way of life evolved in modern times. On their foundation is built that secular democratic state, which is looked upon as highest standard, and the most civilized form of modern collective organization. Root cause of calamities. In our opinion, all the three principles are wrong. Not merely wrong, rather we believe, with full confidence and certainty, that they are indeed the root cause of all those calamities and troubles in which humanity is involved today. As a matter of fact, we are opposed to these principles and wish to fight against them with all our strength. It requires a lengthy discussion to explain in detail the grounds of our objections to these principles, but I will try to convey the gist to you in a few words so that you may be able to understand the significance of our fight against these principles and may be enabled to assess why this matter is one of such grave importance as to compel us to struggle against these principles and work for their elimination and overthrow. Irreligiousness. Let us take first of all the irreligiousness or worldliness, which is the first and foremost foundation stone of this way of life. The theory that God and religion are concerned only with the individual life of a man is completely meaningless, having nothing to do with reason and argument. It is perfectly obvious that the relations of man and God cannot lie beyond either of two alternatives. Either God is the creator of man and the world in which he lives, as well as being its master and sovereign, or he is not so. If he is neither the creator nor the master nor again the sovereign, then it is entirely unnecessary to have even any private relations with him. It is utterly absurd to worship a being entirely unconcerned and having nothing to do with us. But if he is in reality our creator, master, and sovereign, and so also of this universe, then it is equally meaningless that his jurisdiction should be limited to the private life of an individual, and from the very point from which the contact of one person with another commences his jurisdiction should cease and come to an end. If this limitation has been imposed by God himself, then there should be some authority for it, but if man has assumed this independence himself and discarded God from his collective life, then this constitutes an open rebellion against his creator, master, and sovereign. And only a lunatic can claim to combine with this rebellious attitude the claim that he accepts God, his religion, guidance, and directions in his individual life. There can be nothing more absurd than that each person should claim individually to be the servant and slave of God, but when these separate individuals collectively form themselves into a society, they should cease to be servants of the Almighty God, that each component in a society should constitute God's servant, but the composite whole of these parts should not be his servants. Surely it is a proposition which a madcap alone can conceive of. Again, it passes our understanding completely that if we do not need God and his guidance and direction in our family affairs, in the affairs of our town and city, in our schools and colleges, in our bazaars and markets, in our parliaments and government houses, in our high courts and secretariat offices, in our cantonments and police lines, and in our battlefields and peace conferences, then what is other sphere of life left in which he should be needed at all? Why should such a God be accepted and believed in or worshipped who is either so useless that he does not give us any guidance in the affairs of our life, or that he is so foolish that none of his directions to regulate our affairs appears to us to be reasonable or practicable? So much for the intellectual side of this question. But when we look at it from the practical viewpoint, the consequences are extremely serious. The fact of the matter is that whichever aspect of a man's life is divested of relationship with God, will be contacted by the devil himself. Truly speaking, the private life of an individual is nothing but a mere name. Man is social being, and his whole life is in fact collective and social. To start with, he is born as a result of the social contact of a mother and a father. On coming into this world, he opens his eyes in a family, and as soon as he comes of age he comes in contact with society, a brotherhood, a township, a nation, a cultural system, a social system, an economic system, and a political system. All these numerous contacts which bind him to others and the other people to him, on the rectitude of them all indeed depends the welfare and success of each individual and all the human beings as a whole. And it is God alone who is capable of vouchsafing to man stable, enduring, equitable, and correct principles, and to prescribe proper limits for the regulation of human contacts. Whenever a man acts independently of the divine guidance, nothing is left of the permanent and firm principles of truth and justice. This is because after depriving himself of God's guidance, no other source is left to seek guidance from, except man's own passions, imperfect knowledge, and experience. That is why in a society, based on the secular system, or irreligiousness, principles are made and unmade every now and then due to the shifting passions of the people. You can see how in every aspect of human relations have entered the evils of injustice, oppression, faithlessness, unbelief, and lack of mutual confidence. Individual, class, tribal and racial selfishness has overshadowed all human affairs. Starting with the relations between any two persons and right up to the relation between nations, there is no aspect which is intact and free from evil and crookedness. Every individual, group, class, nation and country, within its own sphere of jurisdiction, has, wherever possible, evolved laws, principles and regulations to secure, with complete selfishness, its own particular ends and objectives, and none of them cares in the least what effect or influence this will have on other individuals, groups, classes and nations. The only thing for which they care is power and force. Whenever and wherever there is the fear of force, they squeeze in their hands and feet, which are otherwise spread out beyond all limits. But it is obvious that force is not a conscious and equitable thing. It is nothing more than blind power, hence it has never been able to bring about a proper balance and equilibrium in human affairs. Whoever possesses greater force does not merely squeeze others to the extent desirable, but thinks more and more about expanding himself. Hence irreligiousness or secularism implies nothing more than this, that whoever adopts it as his creed and attitude in life will reduce himself to an irresponsible and unbridled servant of his own self, be it an individual, a group, a country, a nation or a group of nations. National selfishness. Let us take up the second principle now. I have just explained the implications of nationalism to you. If it is still fresh in your mind, you can imagine what a curse it is which has overtaken mankind in this age. We do not object to nationality, which is a natural fact and reality. We do not oppose national patriotism providing it does not comprise within itself ill will towards other nations. We do not object to national love either, provided it does not involve and lead to national prejudice, an unreasonable favoritism towards one's own nation, and hatred of other nations. We regard national freedom as right and proper, as it is the birthright of every nation to regulate its own business and look after its own domestic affairs. The rule of one nation over another is wrong and incorrect. What is, however, objectionable, nay even hateful, is nationalism. This nationalism has no reality except that it is another name for national selfishness. If the existence of an individual in a society, who is the slave of his own self and passions and is ready to do anything for his selfish interests, is a curse, if in a town it is a curse to have a family whose members blindly follow their selfish family interests and are bent on helping only themselves, and this by all fair or foul means. If again, in a country that class is a curse which blindly pursues its own class interests and ends without caring for their good or bad consequences to others, then why should not, in the wider sphere of humanity, that nation be treated and looked upon as a curse which defies its national interests and admires the principle that right is that which conforms to our national interests and wrong that which does not conform to them. Verily your conscience will bear witness to the fact that like other selfish desires and objects, this particular selfishness and slavish pursuit of one's own gains and interests is also truly a curse. But you can look around you and see that the modern civilization has involved all nations in this curse and is responsible for converting the whole world into national wrestling arenas and battlefields in which each wrestler is opposed to the other and hates him, and though the perspiration resulting from 2 universal wrestling bouts has not yet dried up, preparations are now being openly made for a third one, the impending World War III. Sovereignty of people. The third principle, when combined with the other 2 principles, completes our misfortune and misery. As I have just explained, democracy in modern civilization means the sovereignty of the people, that is to say, the collective will of a group of people in a particular territory being completely independent and free therein, the laws being subject to their wishes and not their wishes to the laws, and the sole aim and object of government consisting in, and its power of organization being used for, the fulfillment of the collective desires of the masses. Now work that in the first place secularism released people from the fear of God and the grip of stable and enduring moral values and made them unbridled and irresponsible slaves of their self, then nationalism intoxicated them with the wine of national selfishness, blind prejudices, and national pride, and then this democracy, on top of all, completed the picture, and conferred full powers of legislation on these unbridled and intoxicated slaves of their own self. It seeks to prescribe that the sole object of a government is that its power be utilized for the attainment of things which people collectively desire. The question that forces itself on us, then, is how on earth does such an independent sovereign nation differ in this condition from a strong, free, and independent individual who is a rogue and a villain? Whatever an individual knave will do on a small scale when he is entrusted with freedom, independence and power, exactly the same feat, but on a very much bigger scale, will be performed by a whole nation when it is endowed with such powers. And when in this world there be not one nation like this, but all the civilized nations are organized in this manner on principles of secularism, democracy and nationalism, then how can the world escape becoming a battleground for these wolves of the human race? These are the grounds which compel us to regard every social system which is based on these 3 principles as wrong and harmful. We are opposed to the secular, national, democratic system irrespective of whether those who establish and run it are Westerners or Easterners, whether they are so-called Muslims or non-Muslims. On whichever country or nation this curse falls we will warn all God's creatures living therein to beware of it and avoid it scrupulously. The alternative. As against these 3 principles we put forward another 3 principles, and appeal to the conscience of all men to observe and test them for themselves and see whether their own happiness and welfare and that of the whole world depends on accepting these truthful and sacred doctrines or the other wrong principles. As against secularism is the principle of submission and obedience to God. As opposed to nationalism is humanism. As against democracy or sovereignty of the masses is the sovereignty of God and the vicegerency, Caliphate, of the people. Sovereignty of God. The first principle implies that all of us accept God as our Creator, Master and Sovereign as well as of this universe. We seek to regulate our life according to His commandments and to follow His guidance, and not pose as if we be independent of Him and care not for Him. We should not merely offer ceremonial rites to Him but also obey Him and submit ourselves to Him. We should not merely observe His commands and directions as individuals in our private capacity but should do so in every aspect of our social and collective life too. In the sphere of our social, cultural and economic life, in our educational and training institutions, in framing our laws, setting up our judicial courts, running our government, in making war or peace, and in our international relations, we should observe the principles and restrictions laid down by God. We should not be absolutely free to regulate our secular and mundane affairs in whatever way we like. This freedom should be observed within the limits prescribed by the checks and balances imposed by God. These principles and limitations must, in any event, be regarded as beyond our jurisdiction to challenge, modify, or change. Ideological system. The second principle implies that the system of life which is built upon submission to God's will and obedience to Him should have nothing to do with, nor secure any place within itself for, the distinctions of nation, race, country, color, or language, and in no way should it tolerate the pride, prejudice, and selfishness arising from them. Instead of a national system, it should be an ideological system based on certain fixed principles and stable values. Its doors should be open to anyone who accepts these fundamental principles, and whoever accepts them should be able to participate in the organization on a footing of absolute equality of rights without any invidious distinctions. Under such a system, citizenship should not be confined within the geographical boundaries of a state but should be common and based on ideological foundations. Individuals who are not satisfied with these principles or are not prepared to accept them for one reason or other should in no way be suppressed or oppressed, nor should any attempts be made to wipe them out, or merge and absorb them by force. Rather, they should be able to live under its protection, enjoying well-defined and inalienable rights, it being open to them when they are convinced at any time in future of the rectitude of these principles to become members of this system of their own free will and thus secure for themselves equal rights with others. This principle of humanism does not negate the idea of nationalism but seeks to keep it within its natural limits. There is a place in it for national love and patriotism but none for national prejudice. National goodwill is legal, halal, but national selfishness is illegal, haram. National freedom is permissible but domination and selfish exploitation of one nation by another is banned. Nor is any such national freedom permitted as would divide humanity within insurmountable boundaries. The principle of humanism demands that although every nation should regulate its own affairs, no single nation should, as a nation, be under the sway of another nation, and all nationalities which agree on the fundamental principle of human civilization should fully cooperate among themselves in matters concerning human welfare and happiness. Instead of competition, there should be cooperation. There should be no mutual distinctions, prejudices, or divisions. There should be free exchange of cultural ideas and means of livelihood. Every individual who lives under such a cultural system should be a citizen of the world and not merely belong to one country or nation so that he may be in a position to exclaim, "We look upon every country as our own as it belongs to our God." The present state of affairs is abominable, in which an individual can neither be loyal to anyone but his own nation and country, nor can any nation rely on persons belonging to another nation. As soon as a person moves out of the boundaries of his own country, he feels as if God's earth is everywhere full of restrictions and obstructions for him. Everywhere he is regarded with suspicion and distrust as if he were a thief or a fraudster. Everywhere there are interrogations, searches, and harassing restrictions on his pen, his tongue, and his movements, and nowhere does he enjoy freedom or any real rights. We wish in place of all this a universal organization in which the unity of principles should form the basis of a federation between nations, and wherein equal and common citizenship and absolutely free and unrestricted communications should be allowed. Our eyes wish to see again how a modern Ibn Battuta can go about from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific and not be treated as an alien anywhere, rather opportunities are open to him everywhere of becoming a judge, a magistrate, a minister, or an ambassador. Vicegerency. Let us take up the third principle now. We believe in the vicegerency, caliphate, of the people instead of their sovereignty. We are as much opposed, as the biggest democrat can be, to personal monarchy, the power of the rich feudal lords, and the class monopolies. We insist as much as the greatest protagonist of Western democracy does on equal rights and free and equal opportunities for every person in a social order. We also believe that governmental administration and the election of rulers should be made with the free consent and votes of all inhabitants. We too are strongly opposed to a social system in which there is no freedom of expression of opinion, of assembly and of action, or in which there may be special rights reserved for certain people on grounds of race, birth or class, and special disabilities imposed on others on this very basis. There are no differences between the Western democracy and our own type of democracy in these matters, which form the very essence, as it were, of true democracy. There is nothing in this respect which we may have to learn from the West. The Muslims know this democracy very well and gave a practical illustration of it long centuries before the birth of Western democracy. When we differ, and differ violently, from this newfangled democracy is that it puts forward the principle of unrestricted sovereignty of the masses while we consider it wrong from the viewpoint of reality and disastrous from the aspect of its consequences. The fact of the matter is that the right of sovereignty vests in him who created mankind, arranges their sustenance and development, on whom depends the very existence of humanity and the whole world, and in whose firm grip lies every single thing that exists in the universe. Any claim to sovereignty, whether of a person or a family, of a nation, or the masses as a whole, within the sphere of his real and factual sovereignty, is nothing more than a myth and a misconception. And the evil consequences of this misunderstanding will fall not on the real sovereign of the universe but on the foolish claimant who does not realize his own place and position. In the face of this reality, the only attitude which is correct in principle and correct from the viewpoint of consequential welfare of man is to accept God as his sovereign and evolve a system of government for human life on the basis of the theory of his caliphate and representative character. This caliphate should doubtless be democratic. The election of the emir as the administrator should be made by the franchise of the masses, the members of the assembly should be elected by votes, all governmental matters should be administered with their advice, they should have the fullest right to criticize and call them to account. But all this should be done with the consciousness and feeling that God is the sovereign and not the people. We are his vicegerents only and have to render an account of every action to him who is our real master. Moreover, the moral principles and legal commandments and restrictions must be regarded as inviolable and occupy the place God has assigned to them in our lives. The fundamental principle should be that we cannot legislate in matters in which God has given us clear guidance, while in matters in which he has not done so, we must appreciate that he himself has delegated freedom of action to us so that in these matters we may legislate by mutual consultation. Again, these latter laws too must conform, in spirit and meaning, to the pattern which the prescribed principles of divine guidance has laid down for us. Then, again, it is essential that the administration and management of the political and cultural system should be in the hands of people who fear God, who render obedience to him, who seek his will and pleasure in everything, whose lives bear witness to their faith in accountability to God and presentation to him on the day of judgment, whose private as well as public life gives ample proof that they are not like an unbridled horse running about in every field and overstepping all hurdles and limits. Rather, they are tied to the divine system and pinned down to the obedience of God, and their movements are confined to the limits which the divine rope permits them. Choice is yours. Gentlemen, the three principles which I have propounded before you aim at establishing a democratic and human caliphate subservient to God as against the national secular democratic sovereignty evolved by modern civilization, and our object is the establishment of this caliphate. You can at a glance see that there are obvious differences between the two systems. It now rests with you conscientiously to decide which one of them is better, in which one can solve the problems of mankind, which one would you be desirous of establishing, and how your energies should be directed and spent in establishing and maintaining the one you choose.